Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. 2018 was a year of racist and Islamophobic incidents caught on camera. In the era of Trump, Brexit, and a rising far right throughout the Western world, hate of the other is increasingly the status quo. Efforts by grassroots organizations towards better understanding have not been able to control the vast sums of money being spent to keep up this campaign of hatred. To discuss that and a lot more, we're joined here in our studio by Mr. Mubashir Bukhari, who is an analyst. Mubashir, we appreciate you taking your time out and joining us here in our Lahore studios. We're also joined via Skype by Mr. Abdul Rahman Mustafa, who is a faculty member of the University of Edinburgh, and he's joining us via Skype, as I said. We're also joined with Ms. Humaira Khan, who is an activist, and she's joining us from London, and she's a researcher on Muslim affairs. We appreciate you all joining us. Mubashir, if I may, I'd like to start with you and just get your overall impression of hatred in 2018, be it Islamophobic, be it racism of other sorts.
Yeah, the debate is still on whether we should link racism to Islamic phobia or not, right? So there are different definitions, but one thing is established that Islamophobia increased after 2015, after some of the world leaders adopted a narrative targeting Muslims, because there were debates going on that Muslims are not a race. But then we saw, and some of Islamist groups like Daesh, it emerged in 2012, and they added to it, after which this debate started. And some of the lone wolves from Muslim communities in USA and Europe also added to this phenomena,
right.
And that led to what is going on these days.
Okay, so I'm glad you brought up that point about the argument between whether Islamophobia is racism or not, because that's actually an important one, isn't it, Abdul Rahman? And I know that that's something that's been argued about even in the UK at this time, especially with this recent definition that's come out of Islamophobia about Muslimness. Of course, I'm paraphrasing just one word used in that definition. Where do you stand on whether Islamophobia is racism, and is that even important at this point?
I think the real problem really is that secularism lacks the kind of language to accord meaning to religious identities. So it lacks the resources to protect religious identity in the ways that it protects identities which are considered to be more fact-based, like race, possibly gender. And that's because secularism has always had an issue with religion, particularly with Islam, when it comes to treating it as a construct, knowing what to do with it. And so, there can be all kinds of protections given to racial minorities and so on, but when the issue comes when the issue is the protection of Islam, somehow that's always posed as in opposition to the freedom of expression or the freedom of speech. And that creates a kind of narrative in which Muslims find themselves in a no-win situation. So this conflict, inherent conflict between the legal approach of secularism to religion and to Islam in particular, is really, really problematic. It's something that my colleagues and I at the University of Edinburgh are actually studying and looking at right now.
And Humaira, where do you find yourself when it comes to this argument? Because as I cited earlier, we've had that all-party parliamentary group on Muslims, which I'm sure you're aware of, coming up with this definition of Islamophobia as Islamophobia being rooted in racism and being a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Again, this using the word racism for Islamophobia. Is that terminology important, or is this issue beyond that sort of just one of semantics?
I'm definitely extremely disappointed with the APPG definition because it's sort of, for me, it's a lazy policy making. And I agree with your previous speaker who said that part of the problem is that we are now in a secular world or secular society which struggles to know how to integrate religions into it. But I think the challenge for us as Muslims for the long term is rather to have that challenge with the secularists to water down what I'm not stuck on terms. For example, if you want to call it Islamophobia, anti-Islam hatred, anti-Muslim hatred, I'm not stuck on the term. But the reality is that this hatred is a hatred that's been present in British society and Europe as a whole for more than 1400 years. It didn't start with 9/11 or 7/7 or 2015. It's been embedded in the psychology of Europe for a very long time, and it's manifested itself in many different ways. Yes, there is such a thing as scientific racism, but if you follow history from the time of scientific racism, Islam as a faith was never integrated into that, right? So therefore, the hatred of Islam has been parallel with the development of scientific racism. Of course, Muslims are impacted by scientific
if I may,
racism.
and I'm glad you brought up the word integration, because I wanted to actually ask you about that then Humaira. The argument by the other side really is that Muslims do not integrate well into Western societies, be it Europe or North America or even Australia. What do you say to that?
I think that's a myth, which is very sad that Muslims have accepted this. And I've been involved in social policy in Britain for over 30 years, and I've been involved in integrating Muslims into the system. In fact, we managed through the work that we do as an organization to get funding for sexual health resources from Islamic perspective, Islamic counseling, from the mainstream service providers. We made a case through the policy, the way policies are developed, for public services to pay for these things because we are citizens. But what happened with 9/11, we no longer became citizens, but we became a civilization, and it became a global conflict rather than dealing with our local situations.
Very interesting. So Mubashir, there at the end, Humaira brought up this very key term, civilization. And we've heard this term used before, clash of civilizations, haven't we, recently? What do you make of that?
Yeah, exactly. In past, we used to use the word clash of civilizations. And after 9/11, all terminologies changed. And we started using these words like Islamophobia, racism, anti-Islam racism, but all is related to hate crime. And we saw, if you go back in 80s and mid-80s, you will see movie like John Rambo. He's going to Afghanistan and rescuing and helping Muslims, right? Because it was part of agenda, part of propaganda. And after 9/11, you would see movies in which you will hear the words terrorists from Pakistan, terrorists from Yemen, terrorists from Afghanistan. So again, I will say that the word clash of civilization has been converted into this Islamophobia thing. Right.
All right, so Abdul Rahman, a good point to bring up, isn't it? This role of propaganda, especially through media, through films, as Mubashir there pointed out?
I think that's the wider culture is really one part of it, and the media really is responsible for creating a narrative in which Islam continues to be seen, Muslims continue to be seen as intolerant. Let me just give you one example. When the Taliban destroyed the statue of the Bamiyan Buddhas in 2001, that was depicted throughout the West in all cultural media as a form of religious, sort of the clashing of a religious icon, of intolerance, and that sort of thing. Contrast that to the Charlie Hebdo drawings of the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, which was actually the exact same thing, because in Islam, the cultural icon has always been the absence of representation of the Prophet. I mean, that's the majority tradition. And yet when that absence of representation was destroyed by the creation of these cartoons, that was never depicted as an act of intolerance. That was depicted as an act of freedom of expression, liberalism. So, the way Muslims act, the ways of being Muslim are increasingly being seen as intolerant and are being criminalized. Whereas the secular narrative where, you have to be against Islam or to be criticizing Islam in order to establish your liberal credentials, that narrative is actually being strengthened throughout, not just in the media, but also in Parliament. We had the Boris Johnson, the former foreign minister of this country, calling women letterboxes and bank robbers. That's essentially victimizing Muslim women. We happen to know are the most vulnerable women when it comes to, by the great minority of women who are affected by religious violence, by Islamophobia. So there's really a lot going on here, not just in the media, but also in the world of politics.
I see Mubashir wanted to react. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Mubashir.
I have a point. We saw this clash of civilization, vanishing from the scene during 1979 and 89, when we saw America, Europe, and other countries helping Muslims and joining hands with Arab states just to make the world unipolar in Afghan jihad, and we saw them heavily funding Afghan jihad, and at that time there was no clash of civilization, right? And when Muslims and America and Europe defeated Russia and Russia was crumbled, then again this terminology was used in media. And
so what you're saying is politics is playing a role.
Exactly, exactly. It is political agenda. One thing. Second, this claim can be seen in European and Western media. Whenever a Muslim is involved in some kind of violence, that incident gets 400 times more coverage than an incident carried out by a non-Muslim. Right?
Yeah.
It is a vivid evidence that Muslims are being targeted by the media, and a narrative is being developed by Western media in this regard.
Okay, so Humaira, what is your opinion on that? Those 2 points then. The fact that Islamophobia right now has to do a lot with the political nature of things right now, A, and B, what do you make of the media's role in all this?
I mean, of course, all of that is true, but this didn't happen overnight. And what we call the media today was something else 100 years ago, it was something else 500 years ago, and something else 1400 years ago. So this drip sort of public demonizing of Islam and Muslims is not new. But we just get bogged down by definitions. What we haven't done, I mean, we can blame the whole world, but as Muslims, the reality is we haven't come to terms.
Let me go to Mubashir with that then. Mubashir, as you know, there is this criticism, of course, of Muslims just playing the victimhood card. Do you agree with that?
Realistically speaking, I will say that I don't think that Muslims are playing this card, victim card, because when we see a situation in Afghanistan from where America is withdrawing right now after a long battle, spending billions of dollars, rather trillions of dollars, and then when we see Muslims in Syria, Muslims in Iraq, Muslims in Yemen, then there is no need to play this card. You know. Because if we calculate, millions of people died, millions were displaced, generations were destroyed. So why there is a need to play victim?
The reality on the ground. Right?
Reality on the ground is this.
Okay. All right, so let's just go into a short break with that point that Mubashir there made about the reality on the ground. We'll be right back with our guests after this break. Thanks for staying with us, viewers, as we continue our conversation about Islamophobia and racism across the world in 2018. We're still, of course, joined here in the studios by Mr. Mubashir Bukhari, who is an analyst. And we're going to, in this half, add a couple of more voices to this conversation. We're joined now by Rasul Bakhsh, who is an analyst, and he is joining us from Islamabad on the line. We're also joined by Maqbool Ahmed Malik, who is a journalist, and he's joining us on the line from Bonn in Germany, and he is senior editor at DW Urdu. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Rasul Bakhsh, if I may, I'd like to start with you, if I can. What do you make of the role of media and propaganda in heightening Islamophobia and racism throughout the world?
I think as a number of crises in Western democracies have deepened, that include economy, migration, and a lot of dislocations that are taking place because of changes in industry and in economic infrastructure of Western democracies. And the states seems to be overburdened with a lot of responsibilities. And that state overload has continuously created cycles of crises in Western democracies. And one of the expression of those crises is conservative nationalism, religious fundamentalism among different religious denominations in the Western world. And since 9/11, it has taken anti-Muslim orientation. And that is very vividly expressed, if not that clearly in mainstream media, in social media in particular. And those right-wing conservative radio talk shows in North America and Western Europe, and Eastern Europe as well.
Okay, so let me put that point then, Rasul Bakhsh, to Maqbool. Maqbool, if you can tell us, because you're in Germany right now, and I was reading a report about how police there have registered 578 Islamophobic hate crimes between January and September 2018. Those are according to figures that were released on the 13th of this month. Tell us about Islamophobia and racism that you've seen there in Germany.
Thank you very much, Waqar. You're right. There have been many cases of Islamophobia in Germany also in 2018, the year that is just about to finish. But it is not just a phenomenon that has risen out of the blue suddenly. We have seen, of course, then to a smaller degree, such cases also in 2017 and then in the year before. And I fear this process is going to continue also in the year to come, that is 2019 and beyond. But the thing is, Islamophobia, when we talk about that, I would very respectfully actually partly disagree with you also.
Okay.
Islamophobia is not a phenomenon for which you can blame any particular group in any society. It is always like a two-way traffic. It takes two to make a clap, and you have to see that which factors have actually deteriorated the situation and which factors have led to this event, this situation, a condition, a circumstances, where people, they are feeling afraid. The major problem is in Western democracies. I know Mr. Rasul Bakhsh, I really respect him as a scholar. He has rightly pointed out, but the problem is Islamophobia in the West is not just an end product of political and social differences and crises and migration only. Media has played a huge, devastating, destructive role in it also because of the vested interests of the owners of big media houses. That is one thing. And secondly, when you look at Islamophobia, I mean, if you don't hate me, how can I hate you? Simple as that. I mean, there are certain situations in human relations, in societies, where you have to look at things a little bit mathematically. I know 101 examples. You have quoted cases of Islamophobia. I tell you, I've been living in the West, in European Union, in Germany, for over a quarter of a century now. I have seen cases where people, they have unfounded fears. Totally unfounded, baseless. Just
and that's a very good point, Maqbool, because unfounded fears is something I want to pick up on. And Humaira Khan is back with. Humaira, I wanted to ask you, this term unfounded fears, and that is something that's very pertinent to this discussion, isn't it? Because even in the United States, all the studies that have come out have shown that when there is interaction between Muslims and non-Muslims, that fear comes down drastically. What do you make of the need for more such interactions? Are Meet a Muslim type initiatives something that should be happening a lot more, do you think?
Well, I think the point I'd like to make is that you judge a civilization by its own values. And for all those of us who are part of the Muslim diaspora living in the West, we are brought up with some expectations, some ideas. So for me, living in Britain, which considers itself to be an inclusive, multicultural, freedom of expression society, I also expect my personal freedom of expressions and liberties also to be respected. So therefore, I judge Britain according to its own values. And the reality is that there are contradictions in the value system. Otherwise, why should we have legislation such as the Race Relations Act, the Gender Act, and all other legislation which recognizes that there's a embedded institutional discrimination in our society which needs to be addressed? The problem is institutional Islamophobia has not been addressed, and this is something for myself and the organization I'm part of, we've been trying to tackle for over 30 years, right? Because where do our attitudes come from? If we want to tackle race, for example, color, we then have to go back to scientific racism to see how that in the last 500-600 years has impacted on the hierarchy of races and how we see different people according to those definitions. But Islamophobia goes beyond that. It goes back, like I said, 1400 years to a fear, call it what you like, of Islam, a confrontation, a conflict, which has shaped itself in a particular way. So I grew up in the 60s in this country where we learnt about the Saracens and the Moors and the evilness of this sort of Muslim civilization. In fact, we were never taught anything at all about an Islamic civilization, which was the civilization before the Western civilization, right? So this is how either you get airbrushed out of civilization, and that within that vacuum is other very demonized negative ideas of what you represent. This is the precursor to our modern times, right? So therefore, there is this underlying thing. And if you look at the sort of language that people like the EDL, the far right, are using, it is not modern language. It is historical language, going back 1400 years to do with crusaders and religion, and the ideas of women are not modern either. These go back even before Orientalism.
And that's fascinating they brought that up, Humaira, because I want to put that to Abdurrahman, who's also back with us. Abdurrahman, is this historic? Is this, as Humaira correctly pointed out, the EDL does genuinely use terms which, like crusades and et cetera, that she pointed out?
I think that's correct. In many ways, we're seeing the reconstruction of older narratives. Can I just pick up on what I think is a related issue, which is this idea that one of your earlier guests talked about, the idea that it takes two hands to clap. And it's really a narrative that has been repeated here by Sajid Javid, who's a Muslim, as you know, Home Secretary here in the UK, who's recently talked about the fact that the suspicion of Muslims is the result of a rise in Islamic terrorism. So I feel like there is this narrative which somehow tries to justify Islamophobia as an understandable response, perhaps exaggerated, to a legitimate fear. I think that's completely unfounded, because what it does is it holds Muslims to a double standard. No other ethnicity has to, or should have to, ever hold itself accountable for the crimes of its members. I mean, we wouldn't accept that in the case of Caucasian people, Jewish people, any other racial or religious group. It just wouldn't be acceptable. Going back to the point about the EDL, clearly a lot of these issues have to do with lack of access. And the reason why people like Sajid Javid and others choose to target Muslim identity, I think, is because the alternative is for the government to actually spend money on social exclusion. I mean, Waqar, you talked about Meet a Muslim Day. That doesn't cost the government anything, but what would cost the government something is to improve the socioeconomic conditions in which Muslims live and operate. It's not a coincidence. 50% of UK Muslims live in 10% of the most socioeconomically deprived areas in the UK. It's just so much easier for people like Sajid Javid, for example, to talk about Muslims being the problem rather than talking about the failures of governments to properly integrate Muslims.
Rasul Bakhsh, there are some bad apples within the Muslim community worldwide. Should the Muslim community in the West or anywhere really be judged because of those bad apples, because of those few criminals?
This labeling all Muslim communities in the Western world that have immensely contributed to the development of those countries, industrialization. Of course, they are engineers, they are doctors, they are professionals. They are very useful citizens, and 99.99% are very peaceful. And they have become part of native national cultures of those societies. And of course, Western societies have become multicultural with post-colonial migration. And that is a birthright. How you identify yourself with your ethnicity, with your race, with your religion. But that pluralistic framework allows everyone identity, but at the same time, respect and accommodation across civilizations and cultures. That is the problem that has emerged, because some of the Western nations have demanded of migrant communities, particularly Muslims, that they become purely French, purely British, purely German. That is not possible.
Why is that not possible, Rasul Baksh? Isn't that a fair point? If we move to a country, why shouldn't we become purely a citizen of that country?
You become, yes. Let me explain what I said so that it is not misunderstood. They become German in terms of German citizens. They become English in terms of English citizenship. And they can't be above law, and they cannot be considered on the margins of law either. So the political idea of political citizenship is where all citizens are equal. But then when it comes to religious identity, within Western societies, there are multiple streams. And you consider Islam as one of those streams, and not really in conflict with what France is or French values are, because secularism allows you to profess your religion. It is about equality and freedom of religion, and where state has to stand neutral and above religious and other biases. Here, I think there are two kinds of failings. One is on the part of the state, and the other is on the part of some local communities.
If I may come in, Rasul Baksh, I wanted to get Maqbul back in on this conversation. Maqbul, you're in Germany, and I'm wondering, there is the argument made, Maqbul, that the Muslim communities in the West live in ghettos of their own. And this is something that I'm sure you've heard before as well. This is an argument that is brought up a number of times by far-right groups or those who pinpoint the fingers at Muslims. Do you think Muslims do not interact enough, do not assimilate enough, whatever the word may be?
That's very true, and I was going to come to this point also, and partly supporting what Mr. Rasul Baksh just said, and before that, Mr. Abdul Rahman. The point is, just to start with, this whole situation, we are going deep into Al-Qaeda and terrorism and political and post-colonial developments. The historic burden that has led to this situation is, of course, undeniable. No debate on that. But the point is, we are discussing a social phenomenon today under today's circumstances, and we shall be looking more into it from the point of view, the situation, condition, the circumstances that we are seeing today in December 2018. And there, what I see is that, and what is not at all pleasant is that you don't only have borders and walls only on the ground. I mean, you are talking to me when I'm in the European Union and there is a Schengen zone and border-free states, you can move all about. So ground borders practically literally are gone. But in almost all European societies, you do see mental borders and barriers which people are not ready to jump over. And for that, it is the society that is responsible, and partly the governments, they also contribute to it. A negative role is also done by the media, if not all, then at least a part of it. But in my opinion, a huge responsibility lies on the local populations, as much as on the majority population, as also on the minority population. And back to your question now. In Germany, do you know, something pleasant I would say, I'm a Pakistani and a Muslim myself. In Germany, Islam is the second largest religion. Many people wouldn't know that. But the thing is, Muslims here, mostly Turks, who came here as guest workers in the 60s, they still, the older generation, somebody has been living in this country like 35, 40 years. And you hardly can speak one or two correct sentences in German language. How would you justify that? This ghettoization that you have spoken about is very much there, not in the whole length of the Turkish diaspora in Germany, but it is a lot to be seen, and people are reluctant. They do not interact with each other. And these barriers, these hesitations, in German there is a beautiful word for that, these Hemmungen. You feel a little blockade in your mind and emotions which stops you from jumping over a stream on which you are standing on the bank and you just want to cross over. It doesn't give you the courage and the energy just because, not that your legs are working or not working. The thing is, the blockade, the barrier, the brakes, they are in your mind. And I can give you a very good example here, very important to quote.
Yeah.
We are between the 2 years. Technically, you call it in German, zwischen the Jahren 2018 and 2019.
Yeah.
On Christmas Eve, German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, he delivered his annual speech, and in my opinion, it was one of the best ever Christmas speeches by any German statesman, head of government or head of state, that I have heard in the past 25 years. And he said something beautiful. He said that today we are living in a Europe where people, they are having xenophobia, they are having Islamophobia. This is what he meant. He didn't use the word Islamophobia. And we are having huge social splits in almost every country in the European Union.
Okay.
We must have the courage to look at things that why the situation is like that. And for that, he came out with a good answer also. He said, we are missing the courage to talk to people who disagree with us.
Very interesting point there, because I want to put that to Humaira then. Sure, go ahead, very quickly if you can. Yeah, go ahead, yep. Go ahead, Maqbool.
Okay, thanks. The German president said that have the courage to talk to the people that you disagree with, because until you talk, until you take the person who you disagree with also on the same platform with you of equal height and importance, you will start developing distances in minds. And the distance in mind creates a prejudice in feelings. And a prejudice in feelings gives you a reason to hate, to dislike, and to go at a distance with other people socially.
Right.
So this whole chain, Beautified explains so simply. I mean, and in German and Muslim groups of population in Germany, people are living there, thank God, no big riots, no nothing, and Germany is anyway a very peaceful state with less crime rate. But Muslims in Germany, they are not contributing the good, the best that they could to their own more productive and more recognized social integration.
Okay, if I may, if you allow me, Maqbool, I want to put that point to Humaira, because Humaira, again, and I know this is a point that comes up, the ghettoization, not just physically necessarily, but also the borders and the minds, as one of our previous guests are mentioned. What do you make of that situation, not just in the context of the UK, but just globally? Do you think that the Muslim community is responsible in some parts for the fact that it has kept itself separated, be it through elders, for example, who move to the UK or other places in Europe and don't learn English fully, or as Maqbool there mentioned, immigrants who haven't even learned German fully? Those are ground realities, are they, Humaira?
Well, it really annoys me, such arguments, actually, because, for example, for us here in Britain, Britain should be consistent with its own values. Because if they expect migrants to come here and learn the language and do all the things they say, then they should be doing the same when they migrate to other countries. And as we know, the white British people are the least likely to integrate in any country they go to, right? So therefore, let's be equal in what we expect from people. First of all, let's say that I don't think that's true. I've grown up and lived through this. I grew up here in the 1960s. I don't know anything else than living here, right? I've only been back to Pakistan twice in my life. Last time I was 18. That was a long time ago. So I don't know much about being Pakistani, right? So the 20th century was a completely damaged century for us as Muslims. It was the fall of the Khilafat, the sort of end of colonialism. We were damaged as a civilization, and we've not recovered from that damage. I blame us from the point of view that we have not found pertinent movements, pertinent thinking in order to address what our social issues, our political issues are. But this for me is a blame of our leadership. Our leadership, whether religious or political, have let us down, right? But on a social level, for ordinary human beings who are coming from diasporic communities, from fractured backgrounds, and the vast majority of migrants in Europe would not be here if it wasn't for colonialism and the destruction that it left in our countries of origin. Why should my family come here, after all, if things were better over there? So why should anybody come to a country where you get kicked in the teeth all the time? Why should they do that? So therefore, when we came, nobody came here as criminals. Nobody came wanting to turn the state upside down or anything. We came and people got on with it very quietly, but they were faced with discrimination left, right, and centre. And not just us as Muslims, a whole range of different types of migrants who came. And that's why we have legislation to tackle this institutional mentality that there is in Britain or in Europe.
Yeah.
And Britain and all the different European countries have their different experience politically of how migration and politics has been dealt with. But one thing I would say is that somebody earlier mentioned about the Hizb ut-Tahrir and Muhajirun.
Yeah.
I know how these groups evolved in this country. They were nothing. They weren't violent. They had ideas of Khilafah and all that, but they weren't advocating, certainly in a European context, they weren't advocating that kind of violence. They grew because disaffection in Britain grew. The young people were being discriminated by the system. Our Muslim organizations didn't understand them at all. So they were, and then, of course, as somebody said, there was poverty and alienation and a range of things which created a cocktail for young people being anchorless and needing a father figure. So people like Umar Bakri Muhammad and those kind of people, they did, I don't agree with them at all, but they did what none of the other Muslim leadership did. They
Humira, I'm going to interrupt you just
men,
not because I wanted to. Sure, go ahead, just very quickly if you can. Sorry, go ahead, Humira.
Disaffected and discriminated against, and they gave them a family, right? So this is what they did, right? And the rest is history, because then what happened is world politics took over, right, which changed the narrative in this country. So that the issue of integration in Britain and dealing with this system systematically got superseded by the Iranian Revolution, by the Salman Rushdie, by the Gulf War, by 9/11. So therefore the narrative changed for us in Europe.
Okay, let me add another voice. We're trying around the world and trying to get as much of a global perspective on all this. We're now joined by Shukufah Tahiri, who is an activist, and she's joining us from Sydney in Australia, and she's a policy officer at the Refugee Council of Australia. Shukufah, thanks for joining us. And I just wanted to get your view, Shukufah. I don't know if you've heard what our guests have been talking about, but put this into context for us in the Australian perspective about the Muslim community there, about how it's dealt with this issue of Islamophobia, and whether it is looking for outreach, if it's doing outreach and trying to connect with the larger Australian community?
Yeah, I mean, in Australian context, it's pretty similar to the international narrative of how Islamophobia have manifested itself in the European context, and in the US context. It is still a new phenomenon, and there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of combating it. But yeah, the surge of Islamophobia has actually deteriorated in the recent times, and it just seems that Islamophobia has been racialized. The language that Islamophobia has been addressed in the media is one that's very confusing, and Islamophobia, in a sense, is sometimes limiting to what it actually entails, in that it talks about some kind of pathological issue. It doesn't encompass the issue that's structural, institutional, and really with the impact that it actually leaves on the Muslim community here in Australia. Similar to racism, the language that has been used around the media is really Muslim terrorist. When it was Asians, it was Asian gangs. I think there is obviously an interconnectedness between race and racism and Islamophobia, and that is. That is actually manifesting itself, and there have been a lot of studies done as well around media and how that language has been used to kind of deteriorate that phobia that people have, but it's not actual phobia, it's institutional. A recent study that done by University of Technology of Sydney actually collated 128 articles around reporting on racism. Okay. And out of the 128, actually about 68% were on Islam and Islamic terrorism. So that kind of really, the media becomes that mouthpiece that really does kind of scale up how, Muslims are seen in a racialized manner. But there isn't that defense or actually legislative mechanism to actually defend Muslim communities from that racialized prejudice.
Very well. We'll leave that as our final word. And I appreciate all of our guests. We really did try to get as much of a perspective from around the world as we could to try to understand what Islamophobia and racism meant in 2018. Let me go through this list of all the guests that joined us and shared their esteemed opinions with us. In our studios here in Lahore, we had Mr. Mubashir Bukhari, who is an analyst. We appreciate, of course, him coming into our studios here and sharing his thoughts with us. We appreciate Mr. Abdul Rahman Mustafa, faculty at the University of Edinburgh, and he was joining us live via Skype. We were also joined by Mr. Rasul Bakhsh Rais, who is an analyst, and he was speaking to us live from Islamabad. We were joined by Mr. Maqbool Ahmed Malik, journalist in Bonn, Germany, senior editor with DW Urdu. We were joined by Ms. Humaira Khan, activist from London, researcher on Muslim affairs, and at the end there we were joined by Shakufa Tahiri, activist in Sydney, and she's a policy officer at Refugee Council of Australia. Now, viewers, before I end off this specific segment, let me just say that as we've spoken about, there are many facets to this argument of Islamophobia, whether it really is racism, what definition specifically suits it, the historical context, as some of our guests there mentioned as well. All of those are extremely important, but the biggest seems to be, at least, that need for interaction between different groups, that need for tolerance to be able to listen to each other, to be able to live beside each other. That's something that I think possibly we can all agree is lacking right now throughout the world. We'll leave it there for now, but don't go anywhere. I'll be back after a break with Bangladesh. Thank you for staying with us, viewers. In this segment, before we sign off, we're going to talk about Bangladesh's polls tomorrow. The country is set to go to polls tomorrow, as I said, after an election campaign that's been filled with violence. Many opposition candidates have been disqualified. Some have even been arrested, and a significant number of Bangladeshis have even been killed. Questions about how free and fair these elections can be have only grown, as the country's army has been unable to stem the violence, while the government has delayed visas for election observers, raising concerns about the fairness of these elections. To discuss this a bit further, we're now joined by Mr. Afsan Chaudhry, who is joining us live now from the Bangladeshi capital, Dhaka, and he's the Director of Advocacy and Human Rights at BRAC University. Afsan, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. Afsan, I know we've spoken previously on this topic, so I just wanted to get your point of view now, a day before the elections, about where Bangladesh stands right now. There are a lot of concerns by human rights groups. I believe upwards of 20 of them have signed a letter expressing concerns about how free and fair tomorrow's elections will be.
Well, nobody can say how free and fair tomorrow's election can be, but the army has come in yesterday and they're patrolling the streets, so the level of violence has certainly come down. And people, both the government and the opposition are saying that, go to the polls, go to the polls. Police is saying go to the polls. The paramilitary is saying go to the polls. So everyone is saying it's going to be free and fair. But we'll have to wait and see. We are used to not seeing great elections, but so we're looking forward to good elections. But I think it would be very premature to say what is going to happen tomorrow. But
certainly, Afsan, to be fair, and as an academic yourself and somebody who's experienced and is an expert in these fields, I imagine that there is a lot to be concerned about, isn't there? When election observers have had visas delayed, when there have been all these human rights groups expressing concern, that wouldn't all be coming out of a vacuum, wouldn't it?
No, of course. Any situation in Bangladesh should raise a concern of human rights groups, particularly Western human rights groups. But across the board it happens. And we cannot say that in Bangladesh we will be able to pass the human rights test of all these human rights groups. But people's acceptance of what kind of elections they're going to accept may be different. I think one major point that we need to remember is that the last election where it was held under civilian rule was 2001. The last election, the election where actually the military was in 2008. So this is 2018. So it's 10 years. But in between we had one election where the opposition didn't participate. So all this together, people just want to see a fairly decent election. And if they get that, they'll be happy.
But,
but that is not the main concern of ordinary people. I mean,
yeah, for an election to happen, though, son, to be fair, and I apologize for cutting you off just because you're short of time, but
sorry.
I want to ask, for an election to be free and fair and for one to really have confidence in their country's democracy. You would want a viable opposition, wouldn't you? And do you believe that that is the case right now in Bangladesh?
Yeah, well, actually, we definitely everyone wants a viable opposition. And I think the political parties, the two political parties, may not believe in a viable opposition. And it goes for both. I mean, if you want to say in 2014, which I think is a major flaw in BNP's policy, they said that they will not go in for the election, and they insist that people come out in the streets and overthrow the government. If you can make this kind of call, it obviously shows that you do not have confidence. And that is the problem. People don't have enough confidence that the political parties themselves believe in the political process. The structure is very weak. The political structure is weak. As a result, these problems arise. But as far as the people are concerned, if they're given a chance to vote, they will vote for whoever they want. But they haven't had too many elections where they have been able to do that.
So let's talk about choice once again, because I think it's an important point to make when it comes to Bangladesh, where, and I know I believe I'd asked you this when we spoke previously as well, but Bangladeshi politics has for so long moved between Zia and Hasina and Zia and Hasina for so long. Isn't it time for new blood? I mean, is it a good thing for the country to just have Hasina in power for a third term? I mean, why not somebody else?
Why not somebody else? Because political parties are all part of the same class. The ruling class doesn't change. We have 4 layers, like I'm sure in Pakistan, maybe not in India. I don't know much about India. But you have the army at the top, then you have the business class, then you have the bureaucracy, and then finally you have the politicians. The difference is that the politicians are the ones who completely change if there is a loss of power. The other 3 remains. That is why they are so intense, scared, whatever you are. And often that results in violence. So I think the kind of violence that we have seen this time, or intensity or conflict, let's say, even if not violent, I think these ruling class, other members of the ruling class are going to tell them that, you better find a way of coexisting. This is how elitist societies operate. Bangladesh is no different.
All right, so let's say that Hasina wins, and that's pretty much, I mean, I think both of us can agree, even though you may say we shouldn't prejudge the results.
I imagine Awami League has said they're going to win. BNP has said BNP is going to win.
Well,
what do you expect me to say?
Okay, so in the hypothetical situation, if we may have San, that Hasina wins another term, what will that look like for Bangladesh going forward? What will the next couple of years then hold for the country? And do you think that everyone will just sit back and accept such a result?
Yes, of course. If the people have a peaceful election, which is election with sans violence, people are not going to be bothered so much. I mean, the people who are going to discuss, let us say, political democracy would not even be, not more than 5 or 10%. That is the middle class. And the rest of the classes are much more interested in economic issues. The great problem which Awami League is going to face, or the government is going to face, is that they have produced a very large middle class, but not enough job opportunities. And that is where the crisis is going to be. They have to produce a lot more jobs.
Okay, and then finally, just as a final point then, San, when one looks at the rhetoric that has come out of these elections, I wonder, how does one move beyond that the next day? Because, even Hasina's son, Sajid Wazir Joy, I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly, he came out in an interview and basically called BNP candidates, all of them, he called them murder suspects. I'm reading off that quote right now. He called them militants and terrorists that burned people alive between 2013 and 15. That's very harsh language, isn't it? How does the country move beyond that the next day?
You get used to this harsh language in this political. That is what I meant. The political climate is so harsh and so conflict-ridden that people just are turned off. They don't want to participate in it. And that is what is also, the crisis as well as the advantage for any ruling class. The crisis is that they are dealing only with each other. The public participation in this is weak, is small, is little. And that is something they do not take into account. They are much more happy that there is just between the Awami League and the BNP. And Awami League and BNP are now 2 clusters. So obviously that is not something people like, but that is not something people can do much about. And that, I think, is a big issue. As I said, the big problem would be that both the political parties ignore the middle class. But the middle class has grown up. And this middle class, particularly the rural middle class, who are now coming to the cities looking for jobs, and all the 92 universities in Dhaka city alone, can you imagine how many number of graduates are being prepared? Are there enough jobs for that?
Yeah.
That is something Awami League government or BNP government, whoever comes to power day after tomorrow, will have to figure out. The rest, they may be able to take care better, but this is it. And disparity, as I mentioned again and again, economic disparity is a major issue that they will have to address. They haven't looked at that. So political parties basically look at political issues.
Very well, Afsan, we'll have to leave it there at that. The clock has gotten the best of us, but of course I do appreciate you coming in for a rerun of our discussion, and hopefully we'll be talking to you once the election results are out as well, and we'll discuss where your thoughts are at that time. But that was Afsan Chaudhry speaking to us live from Dhaka, Director of Advocacy and Human Rights at BRAC, discussing the elections that are to be held in Bangladesh tomorrow. As I said, viewers, a lot of concerns by human rights groups, international human rights groups, and mind you, not just Western ones. I should have clarified that in my question to Afsan as well, but others in the region as well, South Asia and beyond, that have expressed concern about how free and fair these elections really can be in this climate where there seems to have been, at the very least, from the outside, looking in, a clampdown on the opposition. We'll wait and see, of course, how the results and the elections play out tomorrow. But thanks for watching. I've been Waqar Rizvi, and this has been Scope.